You're listening to the Perth Property Show, Australia's only weekly property podcast by West Australian experts for West Australian listeners. Catch your latest episode every Monday at 7 a.m.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perth Property Show. My name's Trent, Fleskens, your host as always. I hope everyone had a fantastic and relaxing Christmas over the last week and are looking forward to some time with friends celebrating the new year in the next couple of days. And what a year it has been. 2024 has seen us powering ahead in Western Australia with price growth. It's a polarizing thing, really, when you think about it. Those who own property increasing their wealth every day, on paper at least, and those without property falling behind further and further as they continue that search for the perfect home, the perfect investment property, or simply just being beaten at the post by those a little more desperate than them to make that transaction. Now, 2025, as I posited with Shane Beaumont last week, is going to be about capitalizing on the growth made over the last couple of years by those that have been in the market for that time period. It's about getting out of second gear and into third gear, and we know that what that means is using the equity we've made over the last couple of years to make a move up the amenity chain from places we own to places we would prefer to own, places we live to places we would prefer to live. This is the mover and shaker year going into 2025. It's all about capitalizing on the hard work to date. But we shouldn't forget those who are just starting their journey. And this episode for me is one that's actually quite special because it comes from a relationship I've built with a young 16-year-old lad called Nelson, who's working as a labourer on side of the build of my family home in North Perth right now. The young lad is stronger than me, can carry far more bricks than me, works far harder in much harsher conditions in the sun every day, and I have a lot of respect for him as he helps the Bricky team working along the way. But what I respect him far more for is his insatiable curiosity, not simply about what's going on with the build, but what I do as a client, what goes on in the property market, given he understands my role in the industry, which has led to essentially every day him coming back with more and more questions, another assignment I might give him, and then he'll come back and say, hey, look, guess what I've learned overnight? And so what I did was give Nelson the challenge of having to think about these top 10 questions as a budding future property owner, property investor. He's 16 right now. If he keeps working over the next few years, he will be able to save that deposit to get into the market. As a 16-year-old, what are those top 10 questions you're thinking about with minimal context of the market to be able to make a smart move as quickly as possible? And I know that when I was 16, I certainly wasn't thinking about these things at all. I was thinking about playing soccer, getting on the PlayStation, hanging out with my mates. So I have a lot of respect for you, Nelson, and I think there's a lot of guys out there listening to this podcast, whether they're 16 or 18 or 25 or even 35, who are extremely curious, want to learn, and are listening to this podcast because of exactly that. They want to extract as much information for their own journey along the way. So these are Nelson's top 10 questions. I hope they relate to a lot of the many thousands of listeners that listen along every week, and at the very least will put a smile on your face listening to the questions coming from a young lad looking to learn. At the very best, should round out a lot of the knowledge that you've already got along your journey wherever you are as a listener and property investor in WA. So the first question Nelson asked me was, what is the importance of depreciation when picking a house to buy when buying an investment property? Nelson, really interesting one. We hear a lot about depreciation, especially from property spruikers, because they try and essentially align the idea of saving on your tax with buying a property. Sometimes you hear people say, I need to buy a property because I'm paying too much tax. This is a total misnomer. It's a total misunderstanding about how negative gearing and depreciation and all of these things work. But I'll speak directly to depreciation. The reason we can claim depreciation as an expense, as something that reduces our taxable income on that property at the end of a financial year, is because assets depreciate when you buy, whether it's a house or it's a car in the business or it's a computer. All these assets at some point in time will reach the end of their useful life, and so you're allowed to use an accounting book method that essentially writes down the value of these assets every year, which you can claim as an expense against the income that you've got. So, for example, you can claim depreciation on a brand new house. You can't claim depreciation on a second-hand house. Now, you used to be able to do that, but a few years ago, the ATO tied up that loophole, made that environment much tighter, and we've heard about that in an episode with Carlo Bordi back in the day. You can look up depreciation and negative gearing and those keywords in our podcast search, and you'll be able to learn more about that. But I'll make it clear again, you can't claim depreciation on the house when it's a second-hand house you bought. You can only claim depreciation on a new house or a new upgrade within that property. Now, what it does, for example, if you have a new house, you might be able to claim depreciation to the value of $20,000 in that year. If your marginal tax rate that year is 30%, then what that will do will reduce your tax bill by $6,000 that year. And that's why people say, oh, I'm paying too much tax, I'm going to go buy a negatively geared property, because what they want to do is attribute those book value losses to their current tax so they're paying less tax. But what they're really doing at the end of the day is they're making losses. Now, the real kicker here about depreciation is as you depreciate the property over the years, let's say after 10 years you depreciate the property by $100,000, that reduces your capital cost base by $100,000, so that when you sell the property for, let's just say, even the same price that you built it for, you actually now have made a capital gain, and you have to go and pay tax. Essentially, the ATO sees that as a profit, even though you haven't made a profit in terms of what you paid for it to what you have sold it for. But because you've been writing down the value of it, you then have to go and essentially pay that tax back. And I see that as a bit of a rort. Most people think, oh, I'm making all this money. At some point in time in the future, as long as you sell that property for more than what the written down book value of your house is, you will pay that depreciation back, essentially, by capital gains. The only benefit you might get is that that capital gain might be discounted by 50% if you've owned the property for over 12 months. So that's how it works. That's the importance of depreciation. As investors, we all claim it, but it's not as beneficial as people would have you think. Question 2. What do you need to start in terms of capital when looking to buy a house? Now, let me assume you're looking to buy an investment property that is worth the median house price, and let's say that median house price is currently $730,000. What you would need to do as capital is you need to have enough for the deposit for the home, as well as stamp duty costs. Now, if you're going to be paying for a property that's over $450,000, the state government's currently, and I can't believe they are getting away with this socially, they're currently charging first home buyers for the stamp duty all the way up from $450 all the way up to the median house price. It ratchets up to $600,000, and then when you're up to $730,000, you are paying full stamp duty like the rest of us second and onwards owners, and that stamp duty on $730,000 is around $35,000. So not only do you have to pay a deposit, which will generally be 20, 10, 5, 2%, depending on the loan type that you get of the value of the house, you also have to pay $35,000 in stamp duty for nothing, just to give the government that money. So if you're looking to get an 80% loan with a regular bank as a first home buyer, you'll need to pay the 20% of $730,000, being $146,000. Then you'll also have to pay the $35,000 in stamp duty. So you're currently sitting at $180,000 if you were to get a regular 80% loan to value ratio loan and not pay LMI. Now, one of the benefits of being a first home buyer is you can use the federal government's first home guarantee scheme. And what that does is the federal government is guaranteeing 15% of the 20% you would normally have to put down to not pay lender's mortgage insurance. But the price cap with this scheme is $600,000. Now, you can still buy a bunch of things in Perth for $600,000 or less, certainly a number of units in median house price suburb areas. But that would be one way to minimize your starter capital, where under $600,000, you would be paying only 5% loan and not paying lender's mortgage insurance through this first home guarantee. You will be paying full stamp duty, unfortunately, with the state government at $600,000. So there's around $28,000 there. So you'd be paying about $30,000 as a deposit and $28,000 as stamp duty with the WA state government to do that. So if you budgeted around $60,000 for a $600,000 purchase, that would be a cheap way to get in. The other way is to go through Keystart, a West Australian government-backed lender who allows you to go down to 2%, but their interest rates are pretty outrageous, and I would certainly think twice about going down that path. If you only have 2% to buy a house, I'd probably suggest you should learn to save a bit more first, manage your money a bit better first, and get to at least that point where you can buy a property with a 5% deposit through the federal government's first home guarantee scheme. You'll be paying the same interest rates as everyone else as well, which is a real win for young people looking to budget on generally lower incomes. Question 3. And this is a very good segue. What is LMI and what is the importance of it? So LMI, as I said, is lender's mortgage insurance. And what that is essentially if you go through a regular bank and don't use the first home guarantee scheme that we just spoke about, and you're looking for a loan that's more than 80% of the value of the house you're buying, then the banks need to take out a insurance policy on the risk that you pose to them. It's called lender's mortgage insurance. They make you pay the premium for that insurance policy. And that policy generally, as you scale from a 20% deposit to less and less and less, you'll be paying more and more and more of a premium. That may be anywhere from $5,000 if you're at 18% and you just couldn't get there, all the way up to at least $20,000 when you get closer to 5% and you're not using the federal government's first home guarantee scheme. To be honest, I would suggest the best path forward here is find a property that you can buy under $600,000 and use the first home guarantee scheme so you don't need to pay lender's mortgage insurance. It's a great policy that the federal government has right now. Question number 4, what makes a property a good property? Well, that's a very broad question, but what I'll do is I'll speak purely of the house because I'm sure there'll be a question soon about the where. So what makes a good house that you're buying? One, it needs to check out strongly from a building inspection point of view. The last thing you want is a property that's going to cost you tens of thousands of dollars every year because it's a lemon and it hasn't been built right or it hasn't been maintained right. Generally, a good way to minimize that risk is to start with a house that's double brick. They're far stronger than the old weatherboard houses you'll see in some parts of Perth. There's not many around anymore, but double brick's a good start. Secondly, you want to make sure that your building inspector is very strongly checking a couple of things. One, the strength and structure of the roof. 2, for any damp or moisture coming out of the back of showers, any sort of wet areas, laundries, those can be a real pain. And 3, there is a risk these days of properties that have been built in the early 2000s to mid 2010s that have used a certain type of water piping, a plastic water piping that seems to be breaking all through Perth. So if I was buying a first home these days, it would be one that'd probably be in the 90s. I believe those homes were built the strongest of all that we've had in the last few decades. They're also very big homes, a lot of 4x2s, 4x1s that have depreciated massively, could do with a renovation, and you would have to spend a good $450,000 rebuilding a lot of these properties if you were to do it yourself these days. So a good property is one that has good sized rooms, at least 9 square meters in the bedrooms, has, if possible, an ensuite for the master, if possible, 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms. 3 bedrooms is certainly good enough, so a 3x2. You're looking for a property that is fairly low maintenance in terms of the gardens, with minimal risk in the backyard, with subsistence of retaining, for example. So if you can minimize the retaining overlooking your property, that's also a good one to double check as well. And a house that generally will have a garage. Most people are paying more for a double garage, especially rather than an open property or a carport as well. But at the end of the day, you buy what you can afford. But a good house is I think, one that's plenty of optionality for investment so that you can maximize your rental return to help cover the mortgage that you'll be taking on when you're buying. Question 5, what do you look for in a suburb when looking for investment property? There you go. Let's talk about location. Well, there's 4 things, as I've said many times on this podcast, when we're looking for a suburb that have demonstrated maximum amenity and therefore maximum upside possibility and minimum downside possibility when it comes to price changes. The first is that it's as close as possible to a water source. You want it to be as close as possible to the river and or to the ocean. And it's obvious we see the properties in the western suburbs, they're close to the river and the ocean. But if you can get at least one of those, that's a very good start, and I understand those are pretty expensive. The next you want to be is close to the city. Generally, the closer to the city you are, the more likely the house prices are going to be higher for starters, and they're higher because more people are continually pushing those prices up because they would rather be close to the activity centres and work rather than on the fringes and being stuck in traffic on the freeways. Third is if you can get a property that's in good local state school intake zones. And that is the area where essentially if you live in that area, you can go to that state school. Now, the best state schools are Willerton Senior High, Rossmoyne Senior High, Mount Lawley Senior High, Churchland Senior High, Bob Hawke Senior High, and Applecross Senior High. If you can get a property that fits within those, Linwood is another really good one these days as well, then it's most likely that you're going to have people continually wanting to buy in your area and buy your property, even in times that are a bit softer when it comes to demand and supply across Perth. And then finally, properties that are close enough, walking distance especially, to good activity centres. So when you think about an activity centre, that might be the Strip in Leederville or the Strip in Vic Park or in Mount Lawley or in North Perth. At those sort of places where you can just walk and grab a coffee, people will continually pay overs for properties like that because they want that lifestyle. They'd rather not be in the car and they want to be able to walk down for a coffee or go to the local park, properties close to fantastic parks like McCallum Park in Como or Hyde Park in North Perth, Lake Munga, Herdsman Lake. These sort of places people love being close to when they can as well. So the more of those 4 boxes you can tick, the more likely you're going to have a really strong outcome with a passive investment. Question 6, what types of properties should you look for when looking for your first investment property? For example, a unit, a house, an apartment. Which should I go with? You should be going with the property that has the most land content possible. Now, the last few years has been a bit of an anomaly with the rampant inflation and construction costs, but generally you'll find across history that it is land values that go up over time and house values that go down. That's why we pay land tax on increasing value of land, and it's why we get depreciation on the depreciation of the asset being the house. So generally you want to try and find a property within your budget where the house component is no more than about 35% of the total value of the property you're buying. And what that means is essentially you're probably going out and buying, if we can, a 3x1, 3x2, 4x1 on a full block, if possible, within your budget, where that block may be subdividable now or in the future. There's space for a house behind a house subdivision. The more optionality you've got for a higher and better use for that property you're buying, the better. And so I would always be trying to get a detached property. If you can't afford that, then you essentially just go down the scale of what has less and less land. Now, if you go from detached property, it would probably be semi-detached, so a side-by-side duplex that you may be able to split in half with the next door neighbour you've got, and then you've got your own 400 square metre survey strata property, or a townhouse that would be going down. And then finally, you'll be going to an apartment that's probably 10 to 15 years old. And lastly, it would be one of those 50, 60-year-old flats that you see around Maylands, Bayswater, Vic Park, and these sort of areas. That would be the least likely property to have good growth in the future. So that's the scale. Question 7. If you had an income of around $100,000 and wanted to invest into your first property to rent, what would you do and what would be the steps you would take? Great. Well, the first thing is you've got a good income, especially if you're in your teenage years. I remember making a fraction of that as a teenager. The next thing you need to be doing is understanding your financial position in terms of what you can buy. What's your capacity? So you need to speak to the best mortgage broker in town that you can find that will give you their time and essentially get an understanding for them what your borrowing capacity would be, not only from your income, but also as an outcome of your savings as well, because both of these things limit what you can buy. So based on the savings you've got and the income you've got, the mortgage broker will be able to tell you what your purchasing limit would be. And if that isn't enough, then that simply means you need to save more or get a larger income to get to where you want to be. So the first thing, go and get yourself a pre-approval from your mortgage broker to reflect the loan you need for the purchase price you're going after. Then essentially you need to start hyper-focusing on local areas that you understand to be able to learn about what sort of properties go for what sort of prices and which selling agents are selling them. And from this point, it's all about relationships with those selling agents to get a foot in the door, be treated seriously at the negotiation table, and have the selling agent recommend you and your offer as the one that the seller, the vendor, should be accepting and signing on the dotted line with. That all takes quite a bit of time. It should generally take quite a few months for you to get your head around where it is you want to buy, why it is you want to buy there, what type of property, and who is selling those properties. Take your time, make sure that you're making smart decisions, not overpaying. Listen to as many of the Q&A episodes within this podcast because a lot of the time those questions will help you with learning about the basics. Certainly the episode recently with Jess McLean, who's a settlement agent at Strategic Settlements, answers a lot of those basic process questions of how to put an offer in and how that all works too. So have a look at that episode. Question 8. How did you personally get to where you are as an investor today? Well, that's a loaded question. Could probably spend another 2 hours on this episode talking about it. But to put it as succinctly as possible, I had an income as early as possible, just like you, Nelson, in my teenage years. I remember sitting on the dining table at my grandma's house, looking through the classified for sale ads in the paper, which is now online these days, And for one reason or not, being interested in the opportunity to buy a piece of land that I could build a house on. That one thing led to another. By the time I was 20, I'd moved into my first house that was built for, believe it or not, $150,000 turnkey plus $250,000 piece of land. That property now, 15 years later, is worth over $800,000. So you can see how inflation, having done nothing to that property in that time, has set me up just with my first purchase ever, and that nest egg that can come from there. From that point in time, I recognized that if I had built that property up for $150,000 and paid $250,000 for the land with no stamp duty at the time, within the thresholds of the first home buyer stamp duty free threshold, which is obviously not realistic these days, the property would be worth $550,000 at the time, and I could refinance some of that equity into buying my next property. That was a property that I wanted to do my first small-scale subdivision in Balga, and it was only $360,000 at the time. And from there, progressed on, learning as I did from small-scale subdivision, retain and splits onto triplexes, and larger projects. I then started a business helping other people do that, as not many people were offering it in WA at the time. And over the course of the last 7 years, we've completed over 100 projects for other clients. And now I am back essentially managing my own projects in the more commercial and industrial space these days. So what I would advise is take one step at a time, never bite off more than you can chew, and always focus on mitigating risk before making profit. The things we do in property development or in property investment simply is solving problems for society, and so it should inherently be profitable as long as you can understand where your risks are and mitigate those so that you don't end up losing money, because it's very hard to move forward, especially when you're young, when the first couple of investments end up being a bad one. That's a summary quickly of how I've gotten from being a teenager, where you are at the moment, through the ranks, taking all those steps over the years to now being in much larger projects that are not in the residential space these days. Question 9, what are the biggest and most common problems you can face when investing, and best contingencies to prevent and mitigate those problems? Great thinking. Segues just from what I was saying before on making sure we understand our downside risks. So what are the biggest and most common problems you can face? Well, the first one would be buying a lemon, a property that has more maintenance issues than income possible coming in. And the best way you start to mitigate that is to take your parents, take your building inspector, and do everything you can to make sure the property you're buying has the least structural issues or even cosmetic issues as possible. Because cash flow is king, especially when you're young. We understand that every $100 matters, especially in your teenage years. The next thing you would be doing is making sure you can manage your cash flows. If you don't think that with the rent coming in, you'll be able to pay the mortgage, then you'll be in a seriously painful position when it comes to cash flow, and you won't be able to hold that property. Buying and selling property is very expensive. The transaction cost of doing that is expensive. So you want to make sure that you can afford, with a bit of fat both ways, to buy and hold the property you're about to have a bit of a buffer if, for example, a tenant moves out and moves back in, so that you're never really in financial stress along that journey of owning the property. And then really the more complex an investment strategy you have, it might be renovation, it might be subdivision, it might be further development, the more you need to understand all of the risk factors, all of the things that could go wrong practically, financially, from a planning perspective, so that you've got backup plans. And generally, if you can't quantify your upside, you don't really know exactly how much you're going to make, but you just know it's a good idea, then you really need to make sure you can understand and cost out your downside, and whether you can afford to hold a property if you had delays, or afford to continue with that development if it costs X and Y more. That's why we include contingencies in our developments, in our renovations and these sort of projects, to make sure that we're not going to be on the bones of our ass if things don't go exactly to plan. And I can promise you, they rarely ever go exactly to plan. It's about being able to pick the right property at the right time with the right strategy to make sure you've got as much fat as possible to cover those situations where it doesn't go exactly to plan. Finally, how did you get to where you are personally today? Well, I guess that is an outcome of question 8, really, in that journey. But personally, I think however you define success, I think it always will boil down to being able to do something you love every day. And I'm very lucky I'm in a position where I'm able to work in an industry and do things within that industry that I love. It took me luckily until I was 25 and no later to figure that industry out and that work out. I guess you generally find that when you're doing something you love, you become a student of it because you're addicted to it. And when you're addicted to it and you're a student of it and you're learning harder and faster than most other people. You become an expert and people rely on you, and then they start paying you for outcomes that you can provide that they can't. And then essentially, when you get to that situation, you're worrying less about the cash flow and you're worrying more about outcomes and simply just being fulfilled and enjoying your job. And I think regardless of whether you make $100,000 a year or $10 million a year, it's that happiness and fulfillment to do what you're doing every day that is success, in my opinion. And I'm lucky to say I have that. And doing this podcast, for example, can be a burden sometimes. It can be tough to get there every week, 318 weeks in a row now without missing a Monday. But inherently, I love this industry. I love the people that interact with me. And I'm very grateful, extremely grateful to be able to say that I get up every day, work my ass off, but absolutely love being a part of it. And I think if you can do that, whether it's your job or whether it's a hobby on the side or simply your investment strategy without any emotion at all, and you can enjoy it, then that's success. Guys, that's the end of me signing off for 2024. Have a great New Year's. Thank you so much for listening to the last 52 episodes this year. And Nelson, thanks a lot for those questions, mate. I'm sure in many years to come, you'll be absolutely kicking goals, more so than you are already. You should be very proud of yourself of where you're at, mate. Guys, looking forward to 2025. We'll be here next week with Rash Danjal. Looking forward to our top 10 picks for 2025 in terms of price growth. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Perth Property Show. If you've only just joined the conversation, you can catch up by heading over to our website, perthpropertyshow.com.au, subscribing to the podcast, or joining our Facebook page. Don't forget to tune in next Monday at 7 a.m. for more expert insights, local analysis, and suburb spotlights. Happy hunting!